Welcome back. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a like. Enjoy the video. Valeria adjusted her bag on her shoulder and took one last look at the orphanage that had been her home for 19 years. The large red brick building housed childhood memories and moments of loneliness, but also of friendship and resilience. With a deep sigh, she turned and walked towards the door, her heart racing with a mix of anxiety and excitement for what was to come next on that sunny day. Valeria was about to embark on a new journey with the help of the orphanage director. She had secured a job as a housekeeper at the mansion of Richard Maxwell, a renowned real estate mogul. The opportunity seemed like a distant dream, but now it was within her reach. Upon arriving at the imposing mansion, Valeria was greeted by James the butler, who had served the Maxwell family for over 30 years. His stern gaze and rigid posture intimidated Valeria, but she kept her head high, determined to prove her capability. James showed her around the mansion's premises in a formal and cold manner, his words filled with distrust. "I hope you understand the responsibility this job demands," James said as they walked through the elegant corridors. "The Maxwell family is very demanding and does not tolerate mistakes." Valeria nodded, trying not to show her worry. "I understand, Mr. James. I will do my best." The first few days were challenging. James never missed an opportunity to criticize her work, pointing out any minor slip-up. Valeria felt the pressure increase with every disapproving look from the butler, but she did not let it discourage her. Her determination was stronger than any criticism. Valeria woke up every day before dawn, starting her tasks with admirable diligence. She cleaned the rooms, took care of the common areas, and kept the kitchen spotless. Despite James's constant criticisms, she dedicated herself to learning and improving, absorbing every detail about how to keep the mansion in perfect order. One particularly difficult morning, Valeria was cleaning the chandeliers in the living room when James approached. "You left a stain on the dining table last night," he said harshly. "That is unacceptable." Valeria swallowed, feeling the weight of James's words. "I'm sorry, Mr. James. I will pay more attention." James sighed, still distrustful. "We'll see. Remember, this job demands perfection." Despite the difficulties, Valeria found moments of peace while working. The mansion's garden, in particular, was a refuge where she could breathe and reflect. She would sit for a few minutes during her breaks, admiring the flowers and listening to the birds. It was there that she recharged her energy and remembered the reason she was there: to build a better life for herself. That night, after a long day of work, Valeria lay down in the small bed of her room in the mansion, exhausted but satisfied with her progress. Although James continued to be a critical and demanding presence, she knew she was learning and growing every day. Determined to prove her worth, she closed her eyes, ready to face the challenges of the next day. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Valeria was already up, starting another day of work at the Maxwell mansion. Her goal was simple: to demonstrate that she was capable of performing her duties with excellence, even in the face of James's constant criticisms. The kitchen, one of the places she liked to work the most, was her refuge. That morning she cleaned the surfaces carefully, lost in thoughts about her future. As Valeria was absorbed in her tasks, she did not notice the firm and determined steps approaching. Richard Maxwell, the family's patriarch, had just returned from a long business trip. Exhaustion was stamped on his face, but there was something deeper in his eyes, a silent melancholy, a weight he had carried in his heart since the disappearance of his daughter. Richard entered the kitchen in search of a glass of water, but what he found left him momentarily paralyzed. Valeria was turned away, focused on her work, but the heart-shaped necklace hanging from her neck immediately caught Richard's attention. It was impossible not to recognize that necklace. It was identical to the one his daughter wore the day she disappeared. "Excuse me," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady but feeling a lump in his throat. Valeria turned quickly, surprised by the presence of the master of the house. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell," she replied, trying to hide her nervousness. Richard took a few steps toward her, his eyes fixed on the necklace. "That necklace, it's very beautiful. Have you had it for a long time?" Valeria instinctively touched the necklace, as she always did when she was nervous. "Yes, sir. As long as I can remember, I've had this necklace. I grew up with it. It's always been present in my life. It's the only memory I have of my past." Richard felt a wave of conflicting emotions. The resemblance of the necklace to his lost daughters could not be a coincidence. He needed to find out more about Valeria, her past, and how that necklace came to her. "Interesting," Richard said, disguising the intensity of his thoughts. "Well, I hope you are adjusting well to the job here." "I'm doing my best, Mr. Maxwell," Valeria responded, relieved to have a friendly conversation different from her interactions with James. "Rest." Richard nodded and headed to the refrigerator to get the water he initially sought. But, in his mind, a whirlwind of thoughts was forming. He needed to investigate more about this young woman and the story behind that necklace. Later that day, Richard entered his office and made a call to an old friend, the owner of a respected detective agency. He briefly explained the situation, requesting a detailed investigation into Valeria's past. Something inside him said that this young woman might be linked to his past in a way he never imagined. Meanwhile, Valeria continued her routine, unaware of the storm that was about to form around her. The necklace on her neck, a symbol of her mysterious past, now became the center of a new investigation that could change her life forever. Richard was determined to discover the truth, no matter the cost. Richard sat in his leather chair in the office, the phone still in his hand. The conversation with his detective friend Michael had been quick, but full of implications. Michael promised to start the investigation immediately and ensure that all leads were followed rigorously. Richard knew he could leave no stone unturned when it came to discovering the truth about Valeria. Meanwhile, Valeria continued with her daily tasks, unaware of the investigation now revolving around her life. She followed her routine meticulously, determined to prove her worth, even with James's constant criticisms. That night, after the initial conversation with Michael, Richard decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers, and knew that only a thorough investigation could provide them. He took the phone and called Michael again, formalizing the detective's hiring. "Michael, I want you and your team to do whatever it takes to uncover everything about Valeria's past. Spare no effort or resources. We need answers quickly," Richard said firmly. "Don't worry, Richard. We will start immediately. I'll keep you informed of any progress," Michael replied, understanding the urgency and importance of the request. A few days later, Michael contacted Richard to schedule a meeting. The urgency in his voice made Richard realize that something significant had been discovered. They met in a discreet cafe in the city center, away from curious eyes. "Richard, my team has made significant progress," Michael said, wasting no time. "Valeria was found in a park 17 years ago when she was around 2 years old. She was taken to an orphanage shortly after, where she grew up until recently when she left." Richard listened attentively, feeling his heart race. "And the necklace? Is there any clue about who might have left her there?" Michael shook his head. "No. Not yet, but we're reviewing all available records and interviewing anyone who might remember something. The fact is that someone left her in the park with that necklace, and that doesn't seem to have been an accident." Richard took a deep breath, absorbing the information. "So, Valeria has lived without knowing anything about her past? Without any idea of who her parents are?" "Exactly. The orphanage had no additional information about her, only that she was found in the park with the necklace. We're trying to track down possible witnesses, or any clue about who might have left her there." The thought of his lost daughter had never been so present in Richard's mind. Every detail of the investigation seemed to bring him closer to a revelation he both feared and longed for. He wondered how many times he had been close to the truth without knowing it. "Keep investigating, Michael. I need all the possible answers." "If Valeria is indeed my daughter, I cannot miss this opportunity," Richard said, the determination in his voice palpable. Michael nodded, understanding the urgency and importance of the request. "We'll do our best, Richard. I'll keep you informed of any progress." Back at the mansion, Richard tried to remain calm, but the anxiety was evident. He observed Valeria from afar, imagining how her life might change drastically soon. Every movement of hers, every gesture, seemed to echo the memories of his lost daughter. One afternoon, while Valeria was cleaning the library, Richard entered unexpectedly. She looked at him surprised, but smiled shyly. "Can I help with something, Mr. Maxwell?" Richard hesitated for a moment. "No, I just wanted to see how your work is going. Are you adapting well?" "Yes, sir. I'm learning a lot, and grateful for the opportunity," Valeria replied sincerely. Richard observed the necklace shining in the library's light, feeling a tightening in his chest. "Keep it up, Valeria. You're doing a good job." As Richard left, Valeria felt a strange sensation that something deeper was happening. The days passed slowly for Richard since he began the investigation into Valeria. Each discovery by Detective Michael seemed to bring him closer to a truth he both desired and feared. When Michael finally called to schedule an urgent meeting, Richard knew the moment of revelation had arrived. Michael arrived at the Maxwell mansion with a thick envelope in his hands. He was immediately led to Richard's office, where the businessman was anxiously waiting. "Richard, we've gathered all the available information. There is no doubt that Valeria was found in a park 17 years ago and taken to an orphanage. All records confirm this story. The necklace she wears is the only connection to her past," Michael said, handing the envelope to Richard. Richard opened the envelope with trembling hands, leafing through the documents meticulously. Every detail matched the little information he had about his daughter's disappearance. He knew he needed to talk to Valeria immediately. "Thank you, Michael. Now I need to talk to her," Richard said, rising from his chair. Valeria was in the kitchen, finishing arranging the utensils, when James called her to go to Richard's office. Nervous, she headed to the place, not knowing what to expect. Entering the office, she found Richard sitting behind his desk, with a serious but kind look. "Valeria, I need to talk to you about something very important," Richard began, trying to keep his voice steady. "Have you ever wondered about your past? About who your parents are?" Valeria nodded, curiosity and anxiety shining in her eyes. "Yes, sir. I've always wanted to know, but I never had any clue beyond this necklace." Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "This necklace belonged to my daughter, who disappeared 17 years ago. The information we have about you matches her disappearance. I believe there is a possibility that you are my daughter." Valeria remained silent, trying to process what she had just heard. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. "Are you saying that I might be your daughter?" "Yes, Valeria, but we need to be sure. I would like us to do a DNA test to confirm the paternity. That will give us a definitive answer." Valeria felt a mix of emotions: hope, fear, disbelief. "Sure, sir. I'll take the test." Richard smiled, relieved by the positive response. "Very well. I will organize everything. I want you to know that regardless of the result, you are very important to us here." The next day, Richard and Valeria went to a specialized laboratory to conduct the DNA test. The procedure was quick, but the wait for the results seemed eternal. During those days, Richard tried to maintain normalcy in the mansion, but the tension was palpable. While waiting for the results, Richard observed Valeria with a mix of hope and apprehension. He saw in her features of his lost daughter, and could not shake the idea that fate had finally brought them together. Valeria, for her part, felt divided. The possibility of discovering her true origin was both exciting and terrifying. She wondered how her life would be if Richard turned out to be her father, and how that would change everything around her. In the Maxwell mansion, the atmosphere was charged with expectation. James watched everything from afar, distrustful of the changes this might bring. He knew that confirming Valeria's paternity could drastically alter the dynamics in the house, and possibly threaten his position. The following days were pure anxiety for everyone. Richard and Valeria tried to maintain the routine, but the wait for the DNA test result loomed over them like a shadow. Every phone call, every knock on the door made Richard's heart race. Finally, the day of the revelation arrived. The laboratory called to inform that the results were ready. Richard and Valeria went together to retrieve the envelope that contained the answer to the question tormenting them. Back at the mansion, in Richard's office, they opened the envelope with trembling hands but did not read the result yet. The moment of truth was about to arrive, and they both knew that regardless of what was written on that paper, their lives would never be the same. Richard and Valeria were sitting across the desk with the envelope containing the DNA test result between them. Richard's hands trembled as he held the envelope, and Valeria could feel the tension in the air. The moment of truth had come. "Let us open it together," Richard said, his voice trembling but full of determination. Valeria nodded, trying to contain the anxiety bubbling inside her. With a careful gesture, Richard opened the envelope and took out the document. His eyes scanned the printed words, and he felt the world stop for a moment. "Valeria," Richard began, his voice choked with emotion, "the result is positive. I am your father." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Valeria looked at Richard, trying to grasp the magnitude of this revelation. Tears began to run down her face as she tried to find the words. "You are my daughter," Richard repeated, his voice now filled with emotion. He opened his arms, and Valeria ran to him, hugging him tightly. Both were crying, a mix of relief and joy enveloping them. "I finally found my family," Valeria whispered, feeling complete for the first time in her life. Richard held Valeria's face in his hands, his eyes full of tears. "We have so much time to make up for, but I promise we will do it together." The news quickly spread throughout the mansion, and Margot, Richard's wife, was the next to find out. When Richard told her about the confirmation, Margot was paralyzed for a moment before bursting into tears of joy. "My daughter, our daughter," Margot said, running to embrace Valeria. "I can't believe we finally found her." Margot's embrace was warm and welcoming, filling a void Valeria had always felt. Now she had a mother, someone who loved her deeply and was there to embrace her with an open heart. Joy took over the Maxwell mansion. The employees who had observed the changes with curiosity and apprehension now joined in the family celebration. James the butler watched from a distance, trying to hide his true feelings about the situation. Valeria began to integrate more deeply into the Maxwell family life. Richard and Margot included her in all aspects of family life, from intimate dinners to discussions about family business. The transition was not easy for Valeria, but the unconditional support of her parents made everything more bearable. Richard, in turn, was determined to teach Valeria everything he knew about the family business. He knew it would be a challenge, but he also believed that Valeria had the strength and determination needed to excel. "I want you to know, Valeria," Richard said in one of their conversations, "that I am here to support you every step of the way. You are part of this family, and together we will build a bright future." Valeria nodded, feeling grateful and motivated. She knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but she was also eager to learn and grow with Richard and Margot by her side. She felt ready to face any obstacle. Meanwhile, James watched everything with growing unease. He knew that Valeria's presence would change many things in the Maxwell family dynamics, and consequently his own position in the house. His discontent began to grow, and he could not help but feel a touch of envy and fear about the future. The weeks following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotions and new routines for Valeria. She was gradually adapting to life as a member of the Maxwell family, participating in daily activities and learning about the family business. The mansion, once a place of work, now transformed into a true home for her. One night, during a quiet dinner, Richard and Valeria were talking about her childhood. Margot had already retired, leaving father and daughter to deepen their bond. "Valeria, there's something I've always wanted to know," Richard began, putting the fork aside. Chafed. "Do you remember anything about the day you were found? Any memory that could help us understand better what happened?" Valeria frowned, trying to access the vague and fragmented memories of her childhood. "I was very young, but there's something I never forgot," she said slowly. "I remember a man. He took me to the park. I can't see his face clearly, but I remember he was nervous. He told me to stay there, that someone would come to get me." Richard remained thoughtful, his heart aching at the thought of his little daughter being left alone in a park. "That man, do you remember anything else about him? Any feature? Anything that could help us identify him?" Valeria shook her head. "Not much, just that he was nervous and seemed in a hurry. I think he was wearing a hat, but everything is very blurry." Richard took Valeria's hand, determination forming in his eyes. "That's already something. We will find out who he is and what really happened. I'll contact Michael again and ask him to investigate more thoroughly." The next day, Richard contacted Michael, explaining the new information Valeria had revealed. Michael, always meticulous, assured that he would dedicate all necessary resources to follow this new lead. "I will reopen the investigation with a focus on that description, Richard. We will check records, witnesses, and anyone who might remember something about that day in the park," Michael said, noting all the details Richard shared. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Valeria felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief for finally sharing her memories and having Richard's support, but also anxiety about what these investigations might reveal. James watched the movements with growing concern, his thoughts murky and filled with uncertainties about his future in the house. Michael's investigation quickly began to bear fruit. He interviewed former orphanage employees and residents of the area near the park where Valeria was found. Slowly, fragments of information began to come together, forming a clearer but still incomplete picture. One afternoon, Richard received a call from Michael. "Richard, I have some news. I managed to find a witness who remembers a man leaving a girl in the park at that time. He couldn't see many details, but he confirmed that the man was wearing a hat and seemed to be in a hurry." Richard felt a mix of hope and unease. "That's good, Michael. Capsis. Keep investigating. We need to know who he was and why he left my daughter there." Michael agreed and promised to continue following all leads. Meanwhile, Richard decided it was time to share this news with Valeria. He called her to his office, and together they reviewed the new findings. "We're making progress, Valeria. Every little detail brings us closer to the truth," Richard said, holding her hand with affection. "We will find out who did this and why. You deserve to know the whole truth." Valeria felt a wave of gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Dad. I know we will discover the truth together." As the investigation continued, Valeria and Richard prepared to face any revelation that might arise. United in the search for truth, they knew that regardless of what they discovered, they would face it together, further strengthening the bond they now shared. As the investigation continued, the dynamic in the Maxwell mansion began to change. Valeria, now recognized as Richard's legitimate daughter, was increasingly integrating into family life and business. Margot embraced her with open arms, and Valeria's presence brought new joy to the home. However, not everyone shared that enthusiasm. James, the lifelong butler, began to show signs of discontent. His expression, once impassive, now revealed constant tension. He watched Valeria with a mix of distrust and resentment. With each new responsibility she took on in the family business, James's unease grew. One day, Richard noticed James's change in behavior. The butler was more brusque and impatient, especially with Valeria. Richard decided it was time for a frank conversation. "James, can we talk?" Richard called the butler to his office. James entered, maintaining his rigid posture. "Yes, Mr. Maxwell. How can I help you?" Richard observed him for a moment before speaking. "I've noticed that you've been different since Valeria joined us. I would like to know if something is bothering you." James hesitated, but his expression hardened. "Mr. Maxwell, I have served this family for 30 years. I've always considered my loyalty unquestionable. But with Valeria's arrival, it seems everything has changed." Richard frowned. "James, Valeria is my daughter. She has every right to be here and to be part of the family business. If something else is bothering you, I need you to be frank with me." James shook his head, avoiding Richard's gaze. "Nothing, sir. I'm just adapting to the changes." Richard was not entirely convinced, but decided not to press further at that moment. However, he knew something deeper was at play. James had always been a pillar of trust, but his recent attitude raised suspicions. Meanwhile, Michael continued investigating. He was determined to discover any connection between the man who left Valeria in the park and anyone else who might be involved. Richard maintained frequent contact with the detective, anxiously awaiting new information. The tension in the Maxwell mansion was palpable. James, feeling his place threatened, began to act more erratically. Small mistakes in his daily tasks, sarcastic comments, and derisive glances became frequent. Valeria, although noticing the butler's behavior, remained focused on her responsibilities, determined not to let anything affect her new life. Richard knew that the truth about Valeria's past was getting closer. He also knew he needed to be alert to any signs of betrayal within his own home. James's true nature was beginning to reveal itself, and Richard was determined to protect his family at all costs. After some weeks of investigations, Michael called Richard with an urgent tone. "Richard, we need to meet. I've discovered something important about the man who left Valeria in the park." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm on my way." In the detective's office, Michael presented a detailed dossier. Quote, "Richard, my investigations led to a disturbing discovery. The man who left Valeria in the park 17 years ago was none other than James, the butler." Richard was stunned. "James? That's incredible! Do you have proof of this?" Michael nodded and handed Richard a series of documents and photographs. Witnesses finally confirmed the man's identity, and old records show suspicious connections between James and the events surrounding your daughter's disappearance. Back at the mansion, Richard felt a mix of anger and betrayal. He called James to his office, holding the evidence with trembling hands. "James, we need to talk," Richard said firmly. James entered, maintaining a facade of calm, but Richard could see the nervousness in his eyes. "Yes, Mr. Maxwell. How can I help?" Richard threw the evidence on the table between them. "Explain this to me, James. Explain how you could do this to my family." James looked at the documents, and the color drained from his face. "Mr. Maxwell, I can explain." "There is no explanation that justifies what you did," Richard shouted, his anger overflowing. "You took my daughter, left her alone in a park." "Why?" James finally broke down, his defenses crumbling. "I was desperate. When I learned that your daughter was born, I feared losing my place here. I always thought that without her, you would leave everything to me. I did something terrible, and I regret it every day." Richard looked at James with pain and fury mixed in his expression. "You destroyed our lives. James, I trusted you." "Forgive me, Mr. Richard. I did not do it with bad intentions," James said. Richard, with a whirlwind of emotions knowing the whole truth, decided to call his lawyer so they could go together to a police station. Richard and his lawyer, Dr. Stevens, gathered all the evidence against James and headed to the police station. The weight of the recent revelations was still fresh in their minds, but Richard knew he could no longer delay seeking justice. At the station, they were received by Chief Inspector Harris, a man of stern but fair appearance. Dr. Stevens presented the documents and evidence incriminating James. "Inspector Harris, we have compelling evidence that James, the butler of the Maxwell family, was responsible for the disappearance of Mr. Richard's daughter 17 years ago," Dr. Stevens explained, handing over the dossier to the inspector. The inspector leafed through the documents, examining photos, testimonies, and records. His expression hardened as he grasped the gravity of the case. "These are very serious accusations. We will proceed with the arrest immediately. I need Mr. Maxwell to be prepared to formalize the complaint." "I'm ready to do whatever is necessary," Richard replied with unshakable determination in his voice. Back at the mansion, the tension was palpable. James was visibly nervous, aware that something was about to happen. When the police arrived, he tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed his growing fear. "Mr. James, you are under arrest for the abduction of Mr. Maxwell's daughter," announced Inspector Harris. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you in court." James did not resist the arrest. The handcuffs on his wrists seemed to seal his fate as he was led to the patrol car. He looked at Richard with remorseful and fearful eyes. "Richard, I'm so sorry," James stammered. "I thought I was protecting my future, but I ended up destroying yours. I did this because I was afraid of losing my place here, my livelihood. When your daughter was born, I knew everything would change. I acted out of desperation, not malice." Richard remained firm, though James's words touched a part of his compassion. "James, your desperation does not justify what you did. You destroyed our lives. Now justice will be served." At the police station, James was formally interrogated and confessed to his crimes in detail, explaining his motivations and the fear that drove him to act so cruelly. His confessions were recorded, and he was transferred to prison, where he would await trial. Richard returned home with a mix of relief and sadness. The betrayal of someone he deeply trusted left a painful scar. But there was also a sense of justice being restored. Valeria, upon learning of James's arrest, felt a surge of emotions. The truth had finally come to light, but the path to it had been filled with pain and bitter revelations. That night, Richard, Margot, and Valeria gathered in the living room, embracing and finding comfort in each other's presence. The Maxwell mansion, which for so long had harbored secrets and betrayals, was now beginning to transform into a true home where truth and love prevailed. "Let us move forward," Richard said, looking at his wife and daughter together as a family. "Nothing will separate us again." James's imprisonment marked the end of a dark chapter in the Maxwell family's life, with the truth finally revealed and justice being served. Richard, Margot, and Valeria were determined to move forward and reclaim the lost time. The atmosphere in the mansion began to change, shifting from constant tension to one of hope. and renewal. In the days that followed, Richard decided to spend more time with his family. He reduced his work hours, delegating more responsibilities to his trusted executives. Valeria, for her part, continued to integrate into the family business, but now with a new purpose: to strengthen family ties. Every morning, the family gathered for breakfast, a moment they rarely shared before due to busy schedules. The conversations were light and filled with laughter, with Richard and Margot delighting in listening to Valeria's childhood stories from the orphanage and her dreams for the future. "I want to learn everything about the family business, Dad," Valeria said one morning, "but I also want us to have time to get to know each other better." Richard smiled, touched by his daughter's sincerity. "Of course, dear. We will balance everything. I want you to feel part of every aspect of our lives." The afternoons were often spent in the mansion's garden, where Valeria and Margot tended the flowers and planned new flower beds. The garden, which had always been beautiful, now flourished like never before, reflecting the family's new energy. "This place is more beautiful every day," Margot commented, while planting new flowers beside Valeria, "and I feel that it's a reflection of what we're building together." Valeria smiled, feeling truly at home. "I'm so happy to be here with you. I never thought I would find my family, and moreover, so much love." At night, the family gathered in the living room to watch movies, play board games, or simply chat. Richard and Margot shared stories of their youth, and Valeria delighted in listening to every detail, feeling more connected to her parents every day. In one of those moments, Richard made a suggestion that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Let's take a family trip. Something we've always wanted to do but never had the opportunity." Margot agreed immediately. "That would be wonderful. We can go somewhere special, where we can create new memories." Valeria was enthusiastic about the idea. "I'd love that. We can explore new places and enjoy every moment together." With the trip planned, the family began organizing every detail. The anticipation of new adventures together brought additional joy to the Maxwell mansion. The trip planning was as exciting as the trip itself, and each family member contributed with ideas and wishes. The Maxwell mansion, once marked by secrets and tensions, now resonated with laughter and love. The halls that had witnessed years of loneliness and sadness now vibrated with life and happiness. The painful past was being replaced by a present full of promises and a future full of hope. "We're building something wonderful here," Richard said, holding Margot and Valeria's hands as they looked at the garden illuminated by the moon, a home filled with love and joy. Valeria looked at her parents with gratitude. "I'm so grateful to be here with you. Let's make every day count." With that promise, the Maxwell family prepared for a bright future, united by love and determined to make the most of every moment together. The mansion, now a true home, was a symbol of resilience and the ability to transform pain into happiness, showing that together they could overcome any challenge and build a life full of joy and hope. Here on Karma's Twists, we share the most impactful stories of karma and justice that the world needs to see. Don't miss a single moment of good triumphing over evil. Join our community and subscribe. Be part of the movement that believes justice always wins.